All right, I think we should start. We should be respectful of at least the folks who did come on time. All right, so we'll get started. Um, as I always do, I will give you some context for why I want to talk about this, how this came up. Then we'll talk for a bit. I'll give you what the plot is right at the beginning so that if you want to take a nap, you're more than welcome to. You can wake up when the salad is being served. And yeah, so what happened was that things got a little stressful at work. And then I was like, okay, this is interesting, but I want to find a way out of this. And what's happening? And then suddenly I remembered like something that I'll share in a moment. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. So let's explore this thought even further. And I just kept exploring. I'm like, yeah, so am I really feeling worried or am I worried? What's happening? And then I think I think it was Rishabh or someone who asked a question like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then I was just went down this whole trail of like, okay, let's think a bit more about this. And then voila, we have a topic to talk about. So that was some kind of like context for how this happened. And then the interesting thought that came to me was this. So apparently, the Irish folks don't say that they are sad or they are happy or something. They say happiness is on me or sadness is on me. So they don't have this notion of like their language doesn't support saying I'm happy or I'm sad. So there is like some degree of separation between the feelings and the person themselves. I was like, oh well, that's an interesting thought. Let's explore this even further. And then I was like, okay, maybe they were onto something useful. Huh? That's what you get with a chat GPT subscription. And when you give it the right prompt and you spend like maybe 15 prompts first, and then you get to the right one. So I had to keep, but also ChatGPT did a really stupid thing today, and I absolutely have to share this. So I was like, hey, ChatGPT, give me a picture of a person who's raising their hand in a classroom. Okay. And ChatGPT is like, yeah, sure, I'll give it to you. So it gives me this picture. This kid is with his hand raised. Okay. The board is behind him, and the teacher is behind him. And this kid is raising his hand, very happy. I'm like, okay, this doesn't work, ChatGPT. Let's change this. Okay, here's an alternative. The teacher has his hand raised. The student also has his hand raised. And I said, give me earth tones, and ChatGPT decides it wants to give me a Christmas sweater. I'm like, Dali, whoever set up the model for this, please think twice. But anyway, but this one worked out just fine. So anyway, I digress. But this is the TLDR version of what I want to say. So once you hear this, you may nap if you like. So the starting point would be how we are not our emotions. It's just that we experience them in this world. And in terms of like the Bhagavad Gita, in terms of what Vaishnava theology teaches us, it happens as our senses get into contact with these objects, and how we feel is determined by which mode of nature ends up being dominant. The trouble, though, is that sitting in the mind, these emotions can create a lot of problems if we just let them have their way. It can potentially take over our intelligence, and that's not going to be fun. So the idea then is we want to be steady, we want to be accepting of these emotions, but not unduly influenced by them. But then we're like, okay, so why are we doing all this hard work? It's because what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an environment where you're not swayed too much in either direction so that you have the clarity you require to engage in steady devotional service. Now, why is the steady part so critical? Because Krishna likes steady devotional service. Why should I care for steady devotional service? Because, hey, you get to be in a lovely relationship with Krishna. And the fun part of it is that as much as the whole premise was, oh, I'm having this emotion and there is a separation between me and the emotion and all of that, transcendental emotions, the relationships that we would share with Krishna are quite emotional and quite laden with emotions. And there, some of these problems that we may encounter with like the emotions, the highs and lows we experience here, may not exist there, at least not in a way that it will hurt us. And so that's kind of why we are trying to work towards that goal. So that's kind of the whole plot. And we'll just go over it like bit by bit. Okay. Questions so far, comments, thoughts? I'll pause for a few seconds. Yeah. And yeah, as well, but we'll first start with yeah.
Yeah, why do our highs stay for a lot lesser of a time than our lows? Why is it easier to just fixate on the lows and feel bad about it? Like actually, these emotions can wreak havoc and take over our intelligence and limit judgment.
Depends on the person though, right? Like, I mean, there are some for whom the high stays way longer than it should. And they are very hard to deal with because this person is sticking on to that one accomplishment they had 5 years ago and still thinks that they can boss around everyone just because they succeeded once. So it can work either way. And that it's probably more of a function of where we are and our circumstances and what our design, if you will, looks like and what our baggage, if you will, looks like. Because it reminds me of a situation. So I have this whole problem, which I think many people do, which is whenever someone says we need to talk, it creates a lot of trouble for me. Because I'm like, what's about to happen? What did I do? So the other a couple of years ago, when I was at Stern getting my MBA, this person comes in and she's my like a friend, but she also works. She's actually my boss, but also my friend. But anyway, so she's like, Anirudh, we need to talk. I'm like, what did I do wrong? You did nothing wrong. We just need to talk about something. Okay. Then she was explaining the whole thing. She's like, Anirudh, something went really, really wrong at some point because otherwise you wouldn't be like so triggered by it. So there's something that you're carrying. And so my point is maybe it's a question of work. We put in some work and then we see why it is the way it is. And then but knowing fully well that and that's part of we'll come to that in a bit as well, which is none of what I'm trying to say is me saying ignore trauma or ignore baggage or ignore difficulties. No, none of that. You acknowledge that they exist, but the idea is you work on them as opposed to just letting them control you. But that doesn't solve the problem of having to actually put in all that internal work.
So there's this really famous quote, I think it's by René Descartes or something. So he says that I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, that is Descartes.
Yeah, that's Descartes. So basically, what he means is basically whenever you think, you create an environment in your mind, and therefore you become that. So if you are experiencing emotion, we're technically thinking it, and basically we are living it. So ultimately, doesn't that mean that we'll become our emotion?
And that's exactly the situation I want to avoid. At least in my head, that's exactly the situation I'm trying to avoid. Because at the end of the day, at least the way I think about this, it's still a piece of information, right? The emotion itself is a piece of information. And when I let myself completely perform my decision making and do everything on the basis of that one emotion, I'm kind of discounting everything else that's around it. And so the odds of what Descartes said, people also say it in a different way, where they say, oh, perception becomes reality. But they're both hitting the same thing, which is you pick up one train and then you're just running with it with this laser focus, kind of ignoring everything else that's happening. And that's not good because it's incomplete. And so, not quite sure why Descartes said what he said, but at least for me, that's the gap. And that's the gap we are trying to address because we are saying, hey, true, but limited. And so we need to be able to get out of that paradigm to be able to see what's actually good. All right. So, what does Krishna say about where emotions arise? Krishna says, and like I was explaining before, that wait, my fonts became all messy. Okay, that's fine. I can deal with it. Sorry, it was just ignored. Huh? Krishna didn't say my fonts became messy because Krishna's fonts don't become messy, I guess. But mine just did. But that's okay. I can live with that. I'm only feeling a bit of disappointment, but that's fine. We'll deal with it.
Disappointment.
Sorry?
Is on fonts look beautiful.
No, man, I had something else in mind. Well, okay, fine. This feeling is not worth engaging with, so I'm not going to engage with this feeling. But anyway, coming back to Bhagavad Gita, as I was saying before, so these emotions, it's not like there's nothing sacred about them. They're just happening. It's a reaction. It's happening because you have your senses, they're getting in touch with these objects, and then there's a reaction. And the reaction itself can vary depending upon whether you're in the mode of goodness, whether you're in the mode of passion, whether you're in the mode of ignorance. And more often than not, as someone I look up to explained, it's not one of the three always. They are like cables running together. So it can always be a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of something else. But it's usually some combination of these three modes. And again, it's really a reaction. It's not like, okay, there's nothing particularly sacred about it where we have to be like, okay, this is reality for sure. It's a reaction. It's a piece of information like anything else. Okay. And so then the important part, consequently, is that these are not permanent. Even the emotions, like the highs, as we were talking before, depending upon who we are, the highs may last a while, the lows may last a while, but the key word is that they last a while. They're not permanent. And so if I'm identifying with something that's not permanent, why am I doing it? Doesn't make, at least in my mind, a lot of sense to identify with something that will anyway not exist beyond a point. There are times when I used to do this little experiment with my own thinking, where I would try to think about something that worked out really, really well for me. And then that one day, obviously, I would be very, very happy. And then I would maybe be happy like the next day and the day after. And then I would try to think about that like maybe 3-4 months later and be like, hey, remember how you got that admit, or remember how you got that scholarship? It just wouldn't hit me the same way anymore. And I'm like, okay, I guess we've hit the expiration date on this particular thing. Can't use this to motivate myself anymore. It's done. And so then, in fact, that was partly why I even went on this trail. Like, even in terms of context on why I wanted to think about this, that was the other reason, because I'm like, these highs are not high enough and they don't stay. And the lows sometimes can get very tricky. And so the question was, okay, is there a way? And I was like, okay, this is probably Krishna trying to explain that, excuse me, I think I've answered this question already. Like, I think you haven't gotten the message yet. So maybe go revisit the Bhagavad Gita and there's an answer or two there. And I was like, okay. So then this was the starting point. The fact that these are not permanent. So why am I allowing my identity to be molded by something that's just there? What's even worse is that there is this connection. We make this connection, and then the mind decides to go crazy, absolutely crazy. It will do whatever it wants to do. The emotions dictate what the reaction is going to be, and not always is it going to be super productive. Like, for example, going back to this work situation, I went into this mode where I would just wake up and I'm like, I just don't want to go. What if I can just sleep for like a couple more hours and just somehow magically not have to do anything? And then I was like, oh, that's an interesting concept. And then I thought, oh, maybe there's a lot of depth to this concept. Maybe I should consider, like, why am I feeling this way? And if I investigate this deeply enough, I'm going to get a really lovely answer that will just like clear everything up for me. I'm like, voila, now I'm so excited to go wake up in the morning again. And so I tried. I tried for a few months and I was like, okay, there has to be some deep reason for why I just don't want to get up. And it turned out the answer wasn't as deep. I just got up one day and that was it. It was a lot easier for me. And that's when I clicked in my head that, okay, I thought there is some kind of, deep problem that I'm trying to solve. And my mind kind of did this to me. But it's like, oh my God, Anirudh, like you don't want to wake up. There's something really, really wrong. Then I realized there was nothing. It was just in the mind. It was just a construct. And then I was just like, you know what? I don't want this. Let's just wake up and see what happens. And then it was a lot easier. And I was like, oh, that was a very, very good trick. Well done, mind. I mean, you kind of got me there for a few months before I figured out what the problem was. But that's how powerful the mind is. Even Arjuna says, he's like, yeah, well, Krishna, you're telling me all these lovely things to do, but it's kind of hard to control the mind, It's not straightforward. So how do we do it? Yeah. That is my actual problem with this formatting. That verse was supposed to be a bit lower, but now it's a bit higher. But anyway, okay. So the way the Bhagavad Gita sets it up for us is that there is a hierarchy. Okay. So you have the soul, you have your intelligence, you have your mind, then you have your senses. In an ideal world, the way things would work is that the soul would feed the intelligence would direct the mind, and then the mind basically, like, you get these sensory inputs. And so you're basically letting your soul dictate how you engage with the senses. But what happens though is that if this one gets super powerful, it just hijacks this whole system. And then you're gone. Like now, this is the mind calling the shots. And so the cycle, in fact, goes the other way. The mind is trying to decide, and it's clouding your intelligence. So intelligence, according to the Gita, is how you discern things. And so what the mind is doing instead is that instead of getting instructions from the intelligence on what to do, the mind is actually supplying to the intelligence what to do, which is no. That was me trying to find a very deep reason for why I don't feel like waking up in the morning. It can be. There can be situations where there could be a genuine problem. I'm not questioning that. But there are situations where it's just that the system got hacked. And so in an ideal situation, what we would want is we want this flow. Or in an even more ideal world, just bypass the whole thing altogether. But ignore I said that. We go with it. But then to be able to set up the system requires a bit of education. It requires a bit of calmness so that you can actually let this flow the way it does. And if you let it do its job, then you reach this point where you're very steady, where things are happening. The highs are coming, the lows are coming, but you're not unduly influenced by them. They happen. They happen as they should, because the world is changing. So there will be situations, there will be the good ones, there will be the bad ones, there will be the miserable ones, there will be the absolutely exciting ones. But you're not getting caught up with them. Which is not to say that you're just a potato. You still have feelings and everything, but the idea is that do they control me? Or am I in a position where I can maintain this separation between me and my feelings? And the lovely thing about this, though, is that I think this came up, like someone asked me the other day, they're like, Anirudh, the last time you spoke about being steady, but how does one actually be steady? Like it's all fun and games till you talk about, oh, we should be like steady and all that, but how? And the lovely part about developing steadiness is that there is this kind of cyclic relationship that doing devotional service and doing dedicated devotional service and being steady have. So the idea is that you do your service, you do your devotional service, it gives you this kind of composure. That composure inspires you to do even more service, and then that service gives you even more strength. So it's some kind of a positive feedback loop there. Now, the question though is, okay, that's great, but why do I care? Yes.
Before moving forward, can you please explain that soul to intelligence to mind to soul to mind to intelligence to senses? An example.
Soul to intelligence to mind to senses with an example.
Like the proper function, starting from what would it look like?
With respect to previous slide.
Oh, was that the question? That how would I connect this to like what I showed on the previous one, or no? Your question was, how does this model work?
Yeah.
In terms of an example.
Yeah.
Like some situation
Yeah.
where how this would work, right? Good question. Yashwadanandan Prabhu Shamsaki, do you have an example off the top of your head?
So we can take a few ideas. So if we look at the soul and acting in my awareness of my position as the soul, as an eternal servant of God, Satchit and Nanda, they lived happily ever after, both knowledgeable, bliss, and eternal. Then naturally, my intelligence will start to act according to that understanding of my identity. So then my intelligence, rather than thinking, how can I make my world situation more comfortable, have a better life, better house, better job, etc., it's now, how can I reciprocate in my relationship with God? And so I use my intelligence to direct the mind and the senses in that way. So let's say I'm confronted with a choice where it's between A and B. A might be a very comfortable situation. B might be more conducive to cultivating that relationship. And I'm just saying it in this way just to make it clear. Very rarely is it like such a clear choice of like this and this. So the decision would be based on what is most conducive to that relationship, not necessarily what physically may seem the most comfortable or convenient based on my own preferences. The other way is the senses are governing the mind, which is driving the intelligence, which is covering the nature of the soul. The senses, they just want to experience pleasure. This feels nice. This tastes nice. This looks nice. This sounds nice. And so my mind and intelligence are now hijacked into how can I create more of those experiences for my senses to feel that pleasure? Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've always believed in the power of crowdsourcing, so I'm like super happy. You can even expand on that example if you want to. Like,
It's your show.
it's our show all together. Anyway, by the way, ChatGPT also did a bad job at this one, just so you know.
It's a beautiful event.
Huh?
It's a beautiful event.
Oh, it started with a bad job. I put in the effort to get it to a good job. Did like all these things with people wearing robes and everything. Anyway, I had to work quite hard with ChatGPT. But anyway, so coming back to the steadiness part, right? Like, so I was saying, okay, why is it so valuable? Now, one part of it is, of course, steady facilitates more devotional service. Devotional service facilitates steadiness, as we were looking at before. But then the question is, okay, but so what? What's the goal? What do I get out of it? Remember how I said in the beginning, Krishna says he likes it. People are steady. This is the part I was referring to. So he says, always think of me, you worship me, and then you will get to engage with me if you do all of this. Now, when I read this, and many years ago when I first read this, I was like, how do you always think of Krishna if you're doing things? If I'm driving a car, Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. Odds are I'll get into an accident, so maybe I shouldn't be doing that. Unless someone argues that, well, maybe that was Krishna's way of having you back with him.
And that was right example of your mind taking control over your soul, right?
Yeah, that wouldn't be able to control it, but to your point, I see what you're saying. The intelligence was being controlled by this. So it kind of bothered me for a while till I read this. So then in the Bhagavad Gita, in a different chapter, in a different verse, somewhere else, Srila Prabhupada actually talks about this. And he says, Krishna is not saying don't do what you need to do. That's not the point. You engage in devotional service as appropriate. You bring this kind of consciousness to what you're doing. And that's the whole idea of thinking about Krishna. It's not that there is only one way in which you can do it. You still, whatever you need to get done, you need to get done. That stays. It's just that it needs to be done correctly. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. And as an aside, if you will, this also kind of hits at one of these other like little not a problem, but like a bit of an issue, which is it's not like your spiritual growth and your spiritual goals and your spiritual development is somehow disconnected from everything else that you have to do in the world. They're not. Like my inspiration for thinking about this, for revisiting the Bhagavad Gita, came from my work situation. Whenever I'm working, I'm constantly like, whenever things go awry, I am thinking, like, okay, what's Krishna trying to teach me? So it can be a way to cultivate your spiritual goals. Like these don't have to be disconnected. And that's also what Prabhupada is getting at, right? Like he's saying you still have to do things just the right way. And consequently, there isn't like any proprietary rights that like, any situation holds. It's not like, oh, because I'm working, like nothing spiritually meaningful can happen in this situation. And likewise, even the converse is true that, oh, if I'm engaging in my spiritual growth, does that mean I'm just detaching from everything that I need to do? Absolutely not. Like your spiritual goals and your spiritual investment, if done correctly, will actually fuel other things in your life. And so they're not these disconnected entities as they may seem at times. So then the point is, okay, now I did all of this and what's in it for me? What's the end goal? And the end goal is going to be this relationship that we have with Krishna that will become clear with time. And Shastra teaches us that there are like these 5 unique kinds of relationships. You could be a friend, you could be a lover, you could be just a servant, like something. But that relationship, that's the permanent one. And so the emotions that flow there, they have more depth to them. They're more real. They're not subject to like circumstances, and they are subject to circumstances, but they're not like, they don't entangle you, they don't hurt you, they don't like eat away at you in a way that paying too much attention to your material emotions might. Like this hacking that we were talking about, this is not happening there. This is definitely guiding what you're doing. And so those emotions, number one, feel more wholesome, and number two, they won't hurt you in the way that getting entangled in this whole mess otherwise could. And so the reward, if you will, of engaging in all this steadiness and in cultivating all of this is that we will get to a stage where we can have a more meaningful emotional exchange with God. And that's it. That was all I wanted to talk about. If there are questions, happy to answer.
You have mentioned 1. Is it 1 or a combination of 5?
Loaded question. Loaded question. Where are we going with this again? I'm crowdsourcing it to some extent. Because I know there can be mixture. There are also mixtures in terms of how you feel. These are also the 5 primary ones. There's a bunch of secondary ones, and then there's also interconnections. There's a whole maze of relationships. I decided let's just simplify it and talk about the 5 key ones. But if you're more curious, Nectar of Devotion talks about everything, which is Srila Prabhupada wrote a commentary on it, and so that reads like a bunch of chapters just in prose. But then there's also the source text for it, the Hari Bhakti Vilasa, which actually has the verses and translations. It talks at length about these. The only cautionary note that folks are typically given is handle with care, because it can be quite challenging to read as a text, just because it takes a certain degree of maturity. But to your question, the short answer is 5 primary ones, but then there is like a whole subset of connections, also mixtures, to your question. Other questions, other thoughts, comments? Okay. Thank you for your time and your attention. And whoever is leading the program, do what you need to do. You don't have to. It's totally fine.
Oh, we mean it.
Huh? Oh, okay.
Because you gave
Dang, I was getting answers from you. What am I going to do now? Okay, go.
So sometimes if an emotion comes on especially strongly, how would you recommend that kind of clarity that comes from disassociating my identity with that feeling? Like, because one thing that you mentioned was experience or acknowledging it, but like seeing it, but not as a part of me. So how would you suggest, like, if I'm feeling really angry or I'm experiencing a lot of frustration or I'm experiencing a lot of happiness, what do I do with this?
I can tell you what I try to do, and we can start from there and see where that takes us. Off late, I've been trying to keep my beads as close as I can to myself. Like, usually I have a set of beads either in my jacket and in a pocket somewhere or in my backpack. And there's a good reason for that. The reason for me, at least, is that those remind me that as much as all of this is happening, there is a higher reality. And then, if there is a situation that gets a little too taxing for me, take a time out, and then I try to chant just to create that separation. And usually, Krishna helps in some form, maybe not immediately, but in some form that he deems appropriate. Some other times I maybe talk to dear ones and I'll try to say that this is what's happening. But it all starts with at least for me, it started from me recognizing that this is a problem that I would like to solve. And then the answers slowly started to come. And then I started reading. Sometimes my desk typically also has a Bhagavad Gita or something in some place where it's just like I'm giving myself these visual cues that, so that as life is throwing all these situations at me, I have those. And when probably, if I were to take it a step higher, then the question would be that's probably why we have, or at least a lot of people have dedicated spiritual practices, right? Because then at least there is one chunk of the day that's dedicated to engaging in that relationship and in that wisdom. And then consequently, that could shape what happens. And even if it doesn't, at least hopefully I'll have the remembrance that something else needs to be done. At least that's how I've thought about it. Don't know if it's a satisfying. Guess you're all feeling the burden of midterms. That's probably the feeling at this point. That was it. Thank you again. And